Hello, it's Ed, and I'd just like to let you guys know later on in this episode of History's All Right, it's gonna get a bit tough. We're gonna tackle some darker topics. And so viewer discretion is advised. When you see the helmet on, you know it could get tough. And if you want to stop, take a break, anything like that, that's perfectly fine. But for now, we've got a more lighter tone. But I just didn't want to suddenly drop you in. So, today we're going to talk about characters in role-playing games and how history can help us write good characters. For you see, a role-playing character is different to writing a character in the book. Or a book, sorry. Since the GM and the player are separate minds. And so, the GM isn't playing the character themselves, so they've got to think. And there's also some flexibility, so they've got to come up with ideas based on the characters. And the characters have got to come up with ideas based on what the GM puts before them. And that makes often a very compelling form of storytelling. And from what I gather, it's fun. I've never been in a tabletop RPG group. All the ones I found were full. That's fair enough. Some great people, and it can be a bit difficult if you're very new to the game to jump in. And hey, I have played a lot of single-player RPGs, and watched a lot of Seth Skorkowski's videos. So hopefully I got some idea what I'm talking about, but I may not. But we can still talk about stuff. But anyway, I got some idea, I think. Hopefully. Let's get on with it, shall we? Okay. So, speaking of which, I just want to make a little point here. Because, as anyone who's watched enough of Seth Skorkowski's videos will know, different types of RPG work for different people. And so the advice in this video is probably more relevant towards the sort of intricate role-playing. You know, aspects around secrets, plots, maybe, you know, grey morality somewhat. All this kind of more intricate style of things. The emotional journey, this sort of action, this sort of idea of role-playing thing. I mean, and there are also sort of like more pulpy action, the sort of, or maybe even stuff like cozy crime roleplay. And this will perhaps be a bit less relevant, but maybe in another video. But maybe, you know, writing good pulpy action will be a future topic of History's All Right. Sounds like a good topic, actually. Anyway. And while circumstances in fantasy and sci-fi settings have an effect, I would also argue that in this kind of intricate role-playing, the setting doesn't matter as much. Or at least with what we're talking about. Because these characters will still have human or human-like emotions, desires, personalities, all that sort of thing to put together in the world they're in. And they're still living their story in the same way that, say, a character in the Iliad can be relatable. Well, even though we live in a very different world to Bronze Age Greece and journey. And I'd say that thus this advice, I believe, can be used even in a fantasy or a sci-fi setting. Now, I had planned a video where I'd sort of biographise various people in the court of Louis XV of France. Sorry for the rather dumb French accent there. I had thought of doing something like that, you know, looking at the different ministers, the mistresses, all that stuff, looking at their motivations, and then I realised something. That wouldn't actually be very good advice. With two important reasons. Sort of reasons and things that might seem to be the takeaway. Either it would be just so specific that unless you were role-playing the court of Louis XV in 18th century France, it would be completely useless. Or I'd inadvertently give the advice that's so vague to give you the impression that all you need is something that happened in real life, and that somehow makes a good and believable character in your role-playing game because you took a trait and personality and such from a historical person. Therefore it must be believable because it really happened. And which left me on a bit of a planning thing. What could I actually say? But I was thinking about that. And then thought, actually, that's a key ingredient for writing a good character. Context. Hence our first point. Does the character make sense in the situation that they are in or being sent into or such? I mean, here's an old cliche that's sometimes peddled in the history world. Something along the lines of, if X hadn't happened, then Hitler would have remained a frustrated painter peddling Vienna postcards. Now, yes, I know, 5 of those 6 rubber ducks up there, would be rolling their eyes, if it was possible for rubber ducks to be rolling their eyes with this whole personality thing. And yeah, I'm planning to do a video on the thing historians call playing what if, but there is a level of truth in that. So let's talk about Blair Main, commonly known as Paddy Mane, in the history of the British SAS, and funnily enough, my granny, God rest her soul, happened to serve in the bars that he used to drink in back in Northern Ireland. So, I have a connection to a historical figure. And probably explains my slightly Irish accent at times. And, well, he enters the story of the SAS, as it were, in an army prison, found there by Colonel David Stirling, whose idea for the SAS got off the ground partly because Churchill had had a fascination with Spec Ops since his time being captured by the Boers. And Blair Main was selected by Colonel David, certainly on the condition that Colonel David Stirling was the only officer that Blair Main was not allowed to hit. And now, Paddy Mane was a very complex individual in a lot of ways. Although, if those circumstances hadn't aligned, he'd probably be known for his rugby career with the British and Irish Lions, and, well, the fact that he was somewhat of a disorderly soldier. I mean, there was a reason that Colonel David found him in a military prison. I mean, it's not just about finding a place for, let's just say, if we're being charitable, more assertive temperament. Take William Shakespeare, for example. One of the arguments that he didn't write the plays revolves around the idea that someone with as little education as him could not possibly have created such high art. However, there's a slight flaw to that argument, guys. Prior to the Restoration in 1660, Shakespeare wasn't really regarded as high art. His plays were more the crowd pleaser, and theatre didn't really gain the social respectability it had today until, well, Comer, that should be, into the 19th century. And of course, let's not forget Florence Nightingale or Mary Seacole. Because without the shake-up in army medical care during the Crimean War, neither would have probably have attained any kind of prominence, as in, we probably wouldn't remember them today if it weren't for the fact that they happened to be in that context. You know, if that campaign had gone differently and we decided, well, the Russians and the Turks have really finished off their conflict in Bulgaria and Romania, we might as well not bother. And didn't bother, but felt the need for the whole imperial grand stuff and decided to land in the Crimea anyway. More detail on that in Grenville's Europe Reshaped. Good book, by the way. So, back to my point. Hence, why we often find in history an individual rising to prominence when their own talents, demeanour and life circumstances combine with a situation where those things are needed or in some way wanted by someone or somebody. I've laboured the point about context quite long enough. And another important point here is communication. And it's fair to say communication is a multi-party process. It would require the player to convey their desires and intentions, and for the DM to convey the world the players live in. While this doesn't, I mean, after all, you don't have to have your heart on your sleeve all the time. Time to make this work in every interaction. It can simply be achieved by having, say, little things that build up to a big reveal. So, an idea for a player, sort of acting somewhat consistently. After all, if a character usually tries to talk their way out of a problem, it would be odd for them to suddenly decide to charge it in head-on with an axe, for example. So, there would need to be some explanation. For a historical example, let's take Richard Nixon. And he was known as an ardent supporter of the American way, in spite of a comment in 1967 that American democracy was not for everyone, and where he cited 4 countries for whom it worked. Sources in the description. Now, why did he do this? Well, it's fair to say Nixon was a pragmatist, which is one way of putting it. Nixon wanted to isolate the Soviet Union, but knew that that particular objective would require allies that weren't ideologically aligned. Thus, using the fact that no one would seriously accuse him of communist sympathy, and observing the Sino-Soviet split, he'd talked with Red China to bring them back into the family of nations, switching the USA, recognising the government on the mainland as the government of China. Prior to that, they'd seen the people running Taiwan as the true government of China. But this was so he could isolate the USSR diplomatically. I mean, one could wonder about this in hindsight, you know, given the growth in China, in the power of Red China, or, if you like, the People's Republic of China, and in a different way the European Union, challenging the US global position, might have, I mean, we can all argue about how that might have been, but of course hindsight is 2020, and I'll talk more about this in an episode on writing geopolitics. You know, the conflict between nations, diplomacy by other means, call it what you will. Oh wait, that's warfare. Either way, warfare will be in another episode. But the point is, that's going to be in a different episode. So for now, we get the idea that someone who acts pragmatically, doing a pragmatic thing, because you see, Nixon governed from the centre, even though he had an appeal with the Republican base, which allowed him to get away with supporting a communist regime, because he was using it as leverage against another one. But that's the point. Now, what about if you're a game master? Well, here we're looking to consistency. Some kind of internal consistency so that players can follow the world and its structure. You know, even if there's stuff that's unexpected, perhaps not leave everything totally unexpected. I mean, if they don't do the digging, basically leave the opportunities for digging open, and if the players don't do the digging, they get caught by surprise. That's just part of the thing. But if you leave the digging sites available and they do the digging, then it won't be so unexpected. Funnily enough, the Richard Nixon example works pretty well here too. Anyway, this is the part where we delve into controversial subject matter. And some topics that are going to be pretty painful to talk about. If you want to skip this, go ahead. I'm going to leave the time up here somewhere on the screen, and change into the steel helmet. Don't worry, when the H-hat returns, we shall have passed the difficult subject matter. We're going to talk about some things that viewers may find upsetting. They were upset. And there are some personal experiences for me as well. But it's important to understand. And we're going to talk a little bit about Father Owner and Fallout New Vegas. Obviously, all these observations, all the opinions and views stated in this are mine and mine alone. I want to make it clear that all views in this video are mine and mine alone. To reiterate, the views and forts in this video are that of the creator and not that of Obsidian Entertainment or Bethesda Game Studios / Softworks. And, you know, in all honesty, I cannot speak for anyone but myself. After all, I mean, as companies, it would be impossible for them to have my experience when doing the side quest I'm Not Hurting Anymore in Fallout New Vegas. Now, this video is not aimed at kids, and parents, I would advise you watch this section first before deciding whether it's okay for your kids to know about. If they're watching at all, which I'm not sure would be wise. Anyway, so please, I'd just like to say that important notice. Because I'm gonna level with you guys. This is gonna be honest with you. This is gonna be difficult for me to talk about, and perhaps difficult for you to hear. But, well, if it helps somebody out there, it's better that it's discussed. Because you see, back in high school, I was sexually assaulted by other students. In the changing rooms, other students at times would grab my behind, or fumble me there. It's sad to tell, but it's true. The teachers did everything they could, but as it would happen when my back was turned, there was unfortunately no way of knowing who it was, because I don't know why. They let me change in the toilets to avoid any of these problems happening again. Emotionally, I used to blame myself for what happened. I shouldn't have, but I gotta say that that's true. I was asking myself those questions like, did I do something to lead them on? I just felt so vulnerable, and I used to pray to a God that I used to deny, in the hope that I'd never be as vulnerable again, and that feeling of being isolated and vulnerable carried on. I'm not the best at explaining things, but then again, can anyone explain that feeling of helplessness and rejection as though I was just something that could be toyed with, and how I felt didn't really matter about things. Sometimes felt like that. I mean, I'm sorry I had to tell you guys about this. Sorry all of you out there, you had to hear about this. It's just that it's important. Mostly so that anyone who's watching knows that it's alright to talk about what happened, and there are various support groups and such I've left links to in the description. So you all know. Also, this is why I had to tell you here, because it shows you where I can and cannot be objective, as we proceed into this discussion, and so you can understand where I'm coming from in my understanding and emotional response to both the Favarona controversy and with regards to Fallout New Vegas and the side quest I'm Not Hurting Anymore. Now, obviously it's sad that this subject has to be raised. However, the topic of game safety has become somewhat of a controversial field. While calling people snowflakes for being upset by potentially upsetting subject matter is uncalled for, it's best we understand the root causes of the anger behind the slur, or else we'll just end up flinging insults at each other with nothing being made better. I did find out about the Favarona controversy last year, and plenty has already been said about it. I went back and watched the part of the episode because I found out about the series from the controversy. In all honesty, it was hard for me to watch even though I knew what was coming. So the upset for me is understandable. I don't think any of the people involved had any malicious intent. I think there was a breakdown in communication and such, but enough has been said about it already. Now I'm gonna make how I feel clear, because I believe that the gaming table should be a safe place for players, that ultimately most people are there to enjoy themselves and not hurt each other. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone always needs to set out forms for okay content. Depending on the context, this might be useful perhaps for a professional RPG, or maybe that would be more useful, but for a small group of friends, perhaps just talking about it might help, but such things will vary from group to group. But I'd also like to say that I don't think that this means that potentially upsetting content can't be in RPGs. To explain, I'm going to go talk through I'm Not Hurting Anymore from Fallout New Vegas to give an idea of how to handle potentially upsetting subject matter well. Basically, I'm going to focus on an example of where I think they did it right, so that perhaps we can learn from it. I've made some detailed notes because there are some important points that I think Fallout New Vegas did right when completing, for when Corporal Betsy's side quest, I'm Not Hurting Anymore, which I believe make it an example of how to handle such subject matter well. First thing I'd like to say, which I think is important, the side quest is never forced upon the player. It's perfectly possible to complete the game without encountering the content. The player needs to purposely interact with characters to find out what happened. Even with the most direct route when discussing the bounties for the fiends responsible, the player is told they are nasty people, and even then the details are not gone into. In order to find out the details of what happened to Corporal Betsy, a player needs to encounter Corporal Betsy, requiring you to open dialogue with her, and then ask other characters in her unit about what happened to her. But at each point the player can back out and not involve themselves further. I mean, one thing that you can't really do at the gaming table in the same way is to click save, take a break, reload a save. But this sort of idea of gradual interactions that at any time you can step away from, basically the way out, a gradual way in and a quick way out, were implemented well with this side quest. Secondly, I'd say the timing. I mean, while it's not necessarily required that we're talking about past events, I think it helped with the tone to have this as something that the player encounters after the fact. In that it helps with, as I say, it helps create the tone. Because there's no, sorry, obviously there's a difficult subject to talk about, but one of the things about Fallout New Vegas in general, and this side quest in particular, is you're never dropped into the darker parts of the story without warning, from my experience. And also, no one is smiling about what happened. And perhaps more broadly, no one ever diminishes the gravity of what happened to Corporal Betsy. And it's also made very clear just how much Corporal Betsy and those around her, such as Ten of Spades, who blames himself for getting knocked unconscious and thus not saving Corporal Betsy from being raped by Cook. Just, they never diminish how much it's hurting everyone. And how much these events are still affecting people around her. Also, the story is never really played for shock value. To explain, gradually building the darker tone, the game presents the shocking events and it's more as a sort of grim reality, which, combining with the timing, as moves the focus to the impact of Corporal Betsy being raped it had on her, rather than putting it front and centre, which avoids it being sensationalised. I also argue that the fact that Corporal Betsy is an NPC, which would be or in other words, a non-player character, and thus the player has more distance, allowing the emotional involvement of the player to focus on essentially how this character has been affected by the horrible thing that happened to her. And making it less of a showpiece, as I say, is the actual event itself, which helps avoid it being sensationalised. And thus everyone can sort of see it less of a spectacle and more of a something, more of a horrible thing that we can help with. You know, more about how hard it is, which hard it is for people in that situation. Now, this kind of leads me into my fourth point, and one I'm glad of, the fact that it doesn't just end with you killing Cook. After all, the player in Fallout New Vegas could kill Cook before even arriving or meeting Corporal Betsy, and arriving with where Corporal Betsy is, or meeting her, or anything like that. But, you know, but that's in a sense only part way through the quest, not the end. I mean, it's often an easy route to pin evil on one bad individual and leave it at that. But the makers of Fallout New Vegas didn't do that. I mean, I'll be honest, the pain and anxiety of what happened to me hasn't been any easier, since the fact that it's been years since I even saw anyone from anyone who might have been involved in what happened to me. That hasn't made it easier. And that's why I'm glad that Obsidian Entertainment and Bethesda took a more nuanced route, with the quest not completing until you can convince Corporal Betsy to attend therapy. And this leads me to my fifth point. The player is able to help Corporal Betsy, at least vicariously. Betsy is shown as not wanting to go to therapy and wanting to tough it through, as it were. Lines like, "You don't see any of the others crying over every little bruise and scrape," which might seem unduly harsh, but I can assure you is understandable. It wasn't as bad for me in the sense of what happened, but I could definitely feel a lot of the pain Corporal Betsy was going through. But anyway, the desire to take back control after being assaulted, and worse in Corporal Betsy's case, is very real, and when you've been through a painful experience of not being in control, it can be painful to live through it again, and feeling like you're losing control by opening up Opening up emotionally can cause you to feel that vulnerability again, which, I mean, I should have sought help long before I actually did. As in, for the psychiatric and emotional support side of things, I should have talked to someone about how it was making me, how I was feeling about things, and long before I did. Don't make my mistake, guys. It's always okay to seek help. But I can assure you it can be very hard to do that. If you've felt vulnerable before, it can mirror these things, but the player is left an option to help Corporal Betsy get through these things. Her commander recommends you get her to seek psychiatric therapy at the New Vegas Medical Clinic with Dr. Usanagi. And there are ways you can help her do this. Such as you can talk to her squad mates about how therapy helped them through their own traumatic experiences, and this can you can use that to persuade Corporal Betsy to attend the therapy. There's also a speech check. If you have a high enough speech skill, you can just talk her down into doing it. It does feel like a hard pill to swallow, and I always feel bad using it, which is why I tend to go for the medicine, to have a high enough medical skill at the end of the quest, so that I can use the kinder way. The telling her that she's the that this is holding back the unit and everything like that. That's very harsh. I personally don't like to do that, but I can see why it would be available. And the other characters sort of through bits of dialogue show you that that is quite a painful one to swallow. But the better way and a nicer way that's been made available through you, if you have the high enough medicine skill, is likening psychological therapy to the physical therapy. Telling her that just like you get the medic to patch up a bullet wound, going to therapy is basically just kind of like that. It doesn't make you any less, or because we all need help sometimes. But the point is, I'll say that being able to help Corporal Betsy through also provides some hope. That there is a way through. That thing I think I mentioned earlier about fighting through the darkness to get to the light at the end. How it can happen. I don't know whether it always does, but there is at least some way of helping. That you can help rehumanize Corporal Betsy. That, not just being a rape victim of Cook, And it personally helped me feel better about it, you know, feel like I could talk more openly about it, about the feelings I'd had. I'm not going to say that the quest I'm not hurting anymore got rid of the pain, but it definitely helped me open up about what I'd been through, you know. Through helping Corporal Betsy, you know, it helped me a little bit as well. And lastly, let me tile this together with the point that I personally believe that the side quest I'm Not Hurting Anymore can show us how we can potentially handle potentially upsetting subject matter well. Mostly through being done respectfully and mindfully of those we are playing with and how the subject matter is presented. If it's, you know, if it's a grim reality of the world the game is in, then treat it as such. It's not a showpiece or a idea of perhaps, you know, helping people through. Integrating that with the game made it a lot less tough to go through, and as I say, even because I do definitely believe that most people don't want to hurt each other at the gaming table. I'll reiterate, I don't believe anyone involved in Far Verona had any malice or bad intentions. It was there were mistakes made, and we all make mistakes. And one of my views about history is there's not much point digging up the past if we can't use it to build a better future, so here we go. So, I think we need to keep in mind that while potentially upsetting subject matter, as we saw in the side quest I'm Not Hurting Anymore, can be used, you know, it might even help people cope or process painful memories or experiences. I would say it should be used with utmost care and communication, as well as warning. You know, don't just drop people in. You know, don't just drop anyone in. Don't just drop people in unexpectedly. Hey, whether anyone did that or that, I don't know. I can't comment on things that I haven't seen. And the nuances are always there. Context is very important. In fact, one thing I think that they did very well in this quest is context and communication. Sorry the end of this presentation got so dark. However, sometimes these things need to be said. However, if you watched it all or skipped ahead to this conclusion, I hope that you found it helpful. And especially on this more emotionally difficult episode, it was lovely having you here.